Baldwin for the support on this very important issue. It is remarkable to me. There is almost nobody who is willing to defend this openly, other than members of the financial industry themselves. And yet here we are. So I'd like to introduce Congressman Levin. He is the ranking member of the House Ways and Means Committee and has been a congressman from Michigan for a good long time. Congressman?
Well, thank you. Well, it's really good to be here with you, former colleague who went to, is it the lower house or the upper house? And so many of you to be here. We've been working on this for years. 4 times a carried interest bill passed the House, 4 years in a row. I think the tide is now turning. So the senator and I introduced this bill to close this grievous loophole. And I think there's growing support and bipartisan support. It would raise at least $15 billion. That's probably a conservative 10-year estimate. Some think it would be much, much higher. And this $15 billion, or whatever is the correct sum, and it's a large, large amount of money, goes to a relatively few people, most of whom are wealthy, are already wealthy. And, you know, we've been trying to describe this. Why there's a capital gains rate instead of an ordinary tax rate. And let me try to explain it this way. When someone is working as a manager, the argument is that he or she is risking time without certainty of pay. But when that person goes to a restaurant, this is just one example, there are many others, the person who serves that person also very much risks his or her time. And in many places depends very much on tips that may or may not come. And so there's an issue of basic fairness here as well as the amount of money involved. Why should the fund manager be paying at a capital gains rate? Remember, that person has already received usually 2% in funding. So why should that person be paying a capital gains rate, not the ordinary tax rate, while the person who waited on that person would be paying an ordinary income tax rate? And when it was said that there are few who defend it, actually there have been more than a few. That's why when it passed the House, it never passed the Senate. But what's happening, I think, is that there's more and more insistence in this country on fairness, and a belief that this institution does not respond to the circumstances of the typical family and the typical worker. So, Senator, it's a special pleasure to work with you. You bring your passion to this issue, and I'm so glad that so many of you are here today to share in this passion for fairness in the tax code. So I guess next is going to be somebody who, I guess you're a millionaire. You're a patriotic millionaire, and I look about, and I don't think everybody in this room is one. The senator surely isn't. But I think you can talk to this firsthand. You're a lawyer from Philadelphia, and you, as I understand it, engage in complex litigation, including class action, securities antitrust, consumer protection, and bankruptcy cases. In a sense, this is an issue relating to consumers who want to be sure that when people earn their money and then spend it, everybody has paid in a fair system. So we look forward to your firsthand experiences, Dan Berger.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman. My name's Dan Berger, and I was one of the original Patriotic Millionaires. Incidentally, the Congressman was absolutely correct. I am a lawyer, a Philadelphia lawyer, who does class actions and on numerous occasions, gets paid on a contingency basis, and do not have the opportunity of having my taxes reduced to the capital gain rate as opposed to the ordinary income rate. But let me just tell you a little bit about the group, the Patriotic Millionaires. It was a group that was established in 2011 on an ad hoc basis to advocate slightly higher taxes on the wealthy to address the so-called fiscal crisis that existed at that time. As you know, the issue at that juncture was the Bush the expiration of the Bush tax cuts, and we advocated termination and expiration of the tax cuts, which was effectively an income tax increase on the wealthy. And the basic principle behind that was, as Congressman Levin quite ably expressed it, fundamental fairness. And it was illustrated by what we call the Buffett syndrome. And at that time, Warren Buffett was a member of our group, and he pointed out, quite correctly, and in arguing in favor for the expiration of the Bush tax cuts, that Warren Buffett, one of the wealthiest people in the United States, if not in the world, was paying a lower tax rate than his secretary. So we're back here again. The fiscal situation is different. The combination of economic growth from the recovery and the higher taxes on the wealthy that resulted from the expiration of the Bush tax cuts has put us in a much better fiscal situation. But there's still this issue and principle of, as Congressman Levin so ably put it, of fundamental tax fairness regarding this carried interest provision. I think he explained it well. Nobody can stand up to justify why people who are working and not getting return on their capital, but in fact are earning ordinary income, should be treated at a preferential rate. We're going to hear more about this in the details and possibly the history of the carried interest provision and its special treatment under the tax code, and from some of our other members. But before we do, I'd just like to introduce Senator Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin. You all know Senator Baldwin. She made history shattering the glass ceiling in the Senate. She's a dogged reformer on financial regulatory issues. She was the only senator, as I recall, to vote against the elimination of the Glass-Steagall protections under the federal banking laws. She's a staunch opponent of Wall Street abuses. She played a central role in the drafting of the Affordable Care Act, and she's a staunch supporter on this carried interest provision and reform, and we thank her for that. So I'll give you Senator Baldwin.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I wasn't the only member to vote against the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, but it was one that it was when I was in the House of Representatives, and it is one of the proud votes that I cast, foreseeing problems ahead. But I want to say how much of a thrill it is to team up with my former colleague Sandy Levin on this really, really important legislation. And I wanted to just talk, first of all, very broadly about the moment we find ourselves in, because this is really the compilation of decades of economic and tax policy that has been enacted because of the influence of some wealthy and powerful interests. And these tax policies and economic policies have served to benefit those who are at the very top, but at the time perhaps justified with the belief, or by the belief, that the rewards would trickle down, and that working people throughout the United States would benefit from these economic policies that have come into place over many, many years. I think we know that trickle-down hasn't worked, and instead we've faced, in recent years, very sluggish economic growth and economic insecurity for more and more Americans, more and more of the people that I represent in my home state of Wisconsin. And for far too long, this tax system that's really been rigged in many ways has resulted in rewards that are disproportionately helping those at the top, and, you know, as I said, our workers have seen their wages flatlined. We have a system that results in hedge fund managers in particular paying at a lower tax rate than many truck drivers, teachers, and nurses that I represent. And this needs to change. We know it is not fair. We know it is wrong. We have to eliminate this loophole to make sure that everyone is paying their fair share, and especially so that we can invest in an economy that creates jobs and lifts working Americans' wages. These are families struggling to get ahead. Congressman Levin talked about the recent estimate that this will raise over $15 billion over the course of 10 years. I too have seen numerous estimates that that is a quite conservative estimate. And we know that if we want to have a laser focus on growing the standard of living, growing the wages, growing the incomes of American families, that we have to focus on growth, have to focus on R&D, we have to focus on education, we have to focus on infrastructure. So it is long overdue, but a growing consensus is emerging that the carried interest loophole needs to become a thing of the past. I couldn't be more proud to join with the Patriotic Millionaires in this press event, but hopefully for many days and weeks, and let's hope it doesn't take months, but months to follow as we bring this across the finish line and create a fairer tax system and a fairer economy for America. Next, I'd like to turn the podium over to Morris Pearl, who is chairman of the board for the Patriotic Millionaires.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. It's an honor to work with you. We, the Patriotic Millionaires, have chosen this issue as one of the many tax issues, but this is what we thought was the most egregious example of tax unfairness, the example of the wealthiest among us, managers of hedge funds, of private equity funds, of partnerships, taking advantage of the capital gains rates, which were meant to incentivize investing capital. But it's now being taken advantage of by those who don't actually invest capital, but those who talk about investing capital to other people. And that's not what it was intended to do, but somehow, through loopholes in our tax system, those are the people now able to take advantage of it. We feel that the hedge fund managers should earn money, should earn fees, should get their carried interests, but should pay taxes at the same rate as people who actually work for a living. I think part of the problem is that so many senators, so many members of Congress probably have never met the truck drivers, the nurses, the school teachers who live in Wisconsin, because those people are standing out there halfway to the Supreme Court waiting in line just to get a tour of the building, while the millionaires are being escorted inside into the halls of Congress. And those are the people who the senators, the congressmen meet. When they scurrying around to fundraisers for things like that, they're meeting hedge fund managers who think it's perfectly logical that they should pay lower taxes because either God's countenance shined upon them or because they're naturally deserving people or whatever. But we think that that's just not right. That some people, because they're very wealthy, because they have more access to members of Congress, should sort of have their views more known, more visible to the halls of the lawmakers. And that's why we, the Patriotic Millionaires, have tried to make it known that we don't want to live in a country with a few rich people and lots of poor people. We need to live in a country with a robust middle class, with everyone getting a fair share, because it doesn't work the other way. We don't want to live in a third world country where a few rich people live behind big walls and lots of poor people live in the rest of the country. So we're hoping that Senator Baldwin and Congressman Levin can make this small step to making our tax system more fair for all of the Americans. Thank you very much for your work, Senator Baldwin, Congressman Levin, and everyone else who's working on this issue.
Anybody have a question for the senator or myself? Yes.
How sincere do you think the folks in the GOP are who are calling to get rid of this? I mean, it's usually part of a bill that's a much larger tax cut for the wealthy. So, how do you take that?
You know, I think the main point is that there's now so much pressure in this country because the middle class has been just standing still, in some cases going backwards. And as said, this is such a vivid example of what's wrong. So whatever the motivation is, there is this propulsion that's going on. And I don't think you can do tax reform without ending this abuse. Remember, these people it's not their money. They're managing other people's money and saying, give me a lower tax rate than I otherwise would pay. So this is so vivid that it's pushing people, whatever their motivation, and it's more and more bipartisan. So I hope they're serious. In a sense, they increasingly have no choice. I mean, just look at this. I mean, loophole. Loophole means something small, maybe not in terms of dollars, but in terms of fairness. This is like this, right? I think we will next time have a big, big hole. This is a deep hole in our in our tax program.
I would say that I have become quite hopeful because of the very prominent Republican endorsements of closing this loophole, pointing out its unfairness. We are certainly seeking Republican co-sponsors of our legislation in both houses of Congress who hear that call for fairness in our tax system. And frankly, when every day we're looking at legislation that requires pay-fors in order to make just the most basic investments in growing our economy and the pillars of that, education, innovation, infrastructure, we urge the Congress, both houses, to consider the closing of this loophole as a way to be able to provide that, that funding and that investment in raising America's wages.
I hope that's a good enough answer. Now, really, it's what in the end produces results around here is the push of policy. And this is indefensible.
Senator,
Yes.
are there any Republican senators that the Patriotic Millionaires should go visit and help try to convince?
Every one of them. I assume that you have a presence in every state where there is a Republican senator. I think there's an amazing opportunity for any one of them to be, you know, a leader on this. Everybody, every one of them is talking about the growing income inequality, the stagnation of wages in their states. You know, there's a great opportunity, and I think if you are a member of the Patriotic Millionaires, you have a perspective that needs to be shared. That you want this to happen. It's a green light.
I don't mean to pull the focus off of the carried interest, but to me it's an example of that continuing widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. And this is projected to be $15 to maybe $20 billion over a 10-year period of time. While that's a big number for most people, I understand that, it's really not big in terms of a trillion-dollar budget or multi-trillion-dollar budget. What are some other things that Congress is looking at to help us as a country to try to reduce that incredible divide that's growing yearly? Are there other things that, and even as we as an organization can help with?
You know, this issue is part of the presidential race. And this is a congressional gathering. It isn't a gathering of either political party. But I think the best answer to your question is the importance of the public pressing issues like this in the presidential race and really making people stand up and be counted. Because we're going to have to talk about rates. We're going to have to talk. I mean, I'll give you another example. It relates to inversions. We're going to be talking much more about this. The notion that a company can combine mainly for the purpose of a lower tax rate is really antithetical to the understanding of citizens, the typical citizen when you raise it. And we'll have a big argument about it, but at long last we're going to have an argument. And for people to essentially move overseas but keep their American base in order to pay a very low tax rate. And we should be optimistic. You know, in Europe, they're now beginning to face up to this. And darn it all, we're going to face up to it in the United States of America.
I want to tackle that also. There were a couple of references to the cumulative effect of economic policies and tax policies that came to be because of who had the ear of members of Congress and members of administrations. And so even though people believed at a time 40 years ago that the benefit would trickle down, we know that that hasn't happened. So I would also recommend attention to the issue of the revolving door of people who may work for a large financial services institution and then be brought in to make policy or oversee or regulate, make rules, and then exit again. And we have to be very clear that everybody who serves in public service, whether that be as a member of the Congress of the United States or a member of any administration, is there to serve the people, the public, and particularly the working people of this country.
Yes.
Representative Levin, the new Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, was formerly the chairman of the committee on which you serve and in which you're sponsoring this bill. Can you address, please, why, as chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Paul Ryan did not introduce this bill and the prospects for him introducing it now as Speaker, when in his address as the new Speaker, he made a special point to talk about the fact that the House was broken and that one of his goals as the Speaker was to make it work a little bit more effectively. And it does seem like this is a rare case when Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders agree on something. It seems like if we're going to get something done, this might be one of the things we could get done.
Well, why don't one of you ask the Speaker at his next press conference? No, seriously. I think what's happening in the presidential race is there's more and more attention to what's happened to the middle class of this country. And I come from a district very middle class where I hear it all the time. And the importance of the carried interest issue goes way beyond the carried interest issue itself. So the Speaker needs to be asked about this. And by the way, it's more than a Wall Street issue, because a lot of the people involved here are not, and Mr. Kaplan said, are not on Wall Street. I mean, we need to find a way to spell this out very simply and ask the public whether or not this makes sense. And the answer is, they'll say it makes no sense, while it makes millions of extra dollars for mostly very wealthy people. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. Well, I think we love being a team.
We do, very much
but,
so.
But in the end, the team will be those of you who are outside of this institution as well as those of us who are in this institution. And I think we want to say a special thanks to all of you for stepping up, because when you do this, and maybe we'll close this way, you don't want thanks, but when those of you who have this firsthand experience cry out and say, it isn't fair, then I think there's a special credibility to it. And so speak up and yell out.
It isn't fair.
Thank you. Thank you very much.